Hi, I'm Kelly Cervantes, and this is Seizing Life, a monthly podcast produced by Cure Epilepsy. This month, I'm happy to welcome Jon Tuteur to the podcast. Jon was a busy professional in the prime of his life when suddenly, at the age of 30, he began experiencing seizures. He has written a memoir about his journey with adult-onset epilepsy entitled Seizing Today, Discovering Purpose and Authenticity in a Life-Changing Diagnosis. Jon is here to share his epilepsy journey, discuss how it impacted his life, and ultimately led him to undergo brain surgery. Jon, thank you so much for joining us today. To start things off, why don't you share a little bit of what life was like for you before epilepsy, BE, if you will?
Thanks so much for having me, Kelly. I really appreciate it. Life before epilepsy, you know, pretty normal life. The one thing I like to share with people, I'm a triplet, so that makes things a little bit interesting. I have an older brother as well, so life was a little chaotic growing up, but otherwise just sort of pretty normal life. Work-wise, I was very much a workaholic. I don't think anyone in my life would disagree with that. I was usually working 60 to 80 hours a week, sometimes more. But yeah, pretty normal life.
And then talk to us about how epilepsy entered your life.
So my first seizure, which I didn't know what it was at the time, I was working late at night in my apartment in Washington, D.C., and woke up slumped over in my chair, just sort of confused, and again, just really didn't know what happened. And I kind of just wrote it off as exhaustion, got into bed, fell asleep, woke up the next morning, didn't really think much of it. And then that next day, I was at my client site in Arlington, Virginia, and meeting with a client. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up in an ER. The way he described it to me and to the hospital staff, John's eyes rolled back in his head hit the desk, he fell to the floor and shook a little bit. So at that point, the ER doctor did not diagnose me with anything. It was sort of, we're not really sure. So just continued on with life as normal. And then about a month later, I was in Ottawa, Canada, for another work meeting at the American Embassy. And I'm in a big conference room with about 10 other people. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up in another ER, this time in Canada, with a doctor who very tersely diagnosed me with epilepsy, prescribed Dilantin, and left the room very quickly without me even being able to ask any questions or anything. It was quite frightening. So long story, but that's how it first entered my life.
I wish that people came to an epilepsy diagnosis in a less traumatic way, but there seems to be a pattern here. I'm so sorry that was your experience. I mean, I suppose medically it's 2 seizures before you receive the epilepsy diagnosis. It sounds like you may have had several. You have this diagnosis. You're in a foreign country, albeit Canada. You come home, and I'm assuming you start looking for a neurologist?
Yeah. So my brother, my triplet brother, had a good friend whose dad was a doctor in DC, and he recommended 3 neurologists. And so I went on sort of the neurologist tour, and found someone that I just felt really comfortable with, a woman. And at that point, it wasn't 100% clear because she put me through an EEG. The ER in Canada did as well, but for a very long time, I never had a seizure while I was hooked up to an EEG, and I even had the take-home EEG. And I know this is a common theme also, right? It's sort of when we want to have a seizure, we don't. When we don't want to, we do. So, they didn't know my seizure onset zone. But she, gave me three options for medication: Lamictal, Depakote, and Keppra, and sort of walked me through the side effects. And it was a pretty easy decision. Depakote, the main side effect that I remember, and I know there are others, but it was hair loss, which at 30 years old and single, I wasn't too excited about. Um, Keppra, the moodiness, that wasn't all that thrilling. And Lamictal was relatively new at the time, and pretty benign. The side effects were nothing major, and it was sort of an easy one, and it worked for quite some time.
And I think you brought up that you were 30 years old when epilepsy entered your life. And I think that's a really important fact to take note of, because I think a lot of times the common thought is that epilepsy will enter someone's life as a child or perhaps as the result of a traumatic brain injury. But people don't realize that it can just pop up in your life literally any day.
Yeah. Yeah. uh, Complete shock to me too. And whenever I talk about it, and people just always assume, oh, you were born with it, or you've had it your whole life. No, yeah, 30 years old out of absolutely nowhere. I've never had a TBI. I've never even had a concussion. And to this day, we still don't know. And that's hard too, right? When you're diagnosed with something like this, you want to know, and
Yeah.
the uncertainty is a really difficult emotion. Like, I just want to know. But
And it's so hard to, I mean, how do you treat something? How do you find the right medication if you don't know what's causing the seizures? And so many people think that epilepsy is the diagnosis, but it's really the symptom, right, of something else. And it can drive you crazy if you really dwell on it. And then you come to realize that a majority of the people with epilepsy don't know why they have seizures. So you started on Lamictal, and how did that work for you?
Lamictal was great. Again, I really didn't experience side effects at all. I did not feel different at all, and it controlled my seizures for the most part for a number of years. So overall, Lamictal was phenomenal. It just, unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of medication, the efficacy can wear off, and that's what happened in this case.
So tell us about the kind of seizures that you were having. Obviously, it sounds like the big seizures you had in the beginning were classic tonic clonics, but that wasn't the only seizure type you experienced.
Yeah. So I've kept pretty detailed track of my seizures. I've had over 500 seizures. The majority of them have actually been what's called focal aware seizures. I have had a number of tonic-clonic seizures, what people commonly know as grand mal seizures, but the vast majority are focal aware seizures. And that was another thing that was so fascinating to me, as I started doing more research and asking more questions. And I think this is true for most people. When they think of epilepsy, they think of grand mal or tonic-clonic seizures, right? Someone loses consciousness, falls to the ground, shakes, makes some weird noises, whatever. That's one of, as you know, over 30 seizure types. That was just shocking to me. And so, yeah, focal aware seizures is the vast majority of mine.
Can you explain to people what a focal aware seizure looks like and what it feels like?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I know we're going to get to my book later, but one of the things that I write about, because it's I think it's somewhat shocking and surprising, because I don't think it's what people would think of, and I want people to be able to understand it, and to, as much as they can, walk in my shoes or anyone else's shoes who's going through this. A focal aware seizure. So the aware part, you're conscious the whole time. You're awake. You don't lose consciousness. So I could be having a focal aware seizure right now and having a conversation with you, and you wouldn't know it unless I told you. Now, would I be extremely coherent? Maybe not, but I've been in that situation. I've had conversations at work with people while I'm having a focal aware seizure. So for me, there's sort of three stages. The first stage is there's this awful smell, and I describe it in detail in the book. I will spare you of that here. It's very hard to describe other than to say it's nauseating. Then I get really sweaty, particularly on my hairline, but in other places. And then the way I describe it is it's like there's a movie playing in my head. And some doctors would say, "Oh, it's deja vu." A lot of people, talk about the aura. That's the aura, right? It's deja vu. As I started doing more research, I don't think deja vu is the right term, at least for me. I think it's really what I would call a flashback. So it's a scene from my life that has happened previously that I'm reliving. It's just it's so interesting and strange at the same time.
It's horribly disorienting.
Yeah, disorienting too, and it's sort of like the same 10 or so scenes that would play kind of over and over again. It's really strange. And the other thing about my focal aware seizures, different from my tonic-clonic seizures, is the focal aware seizures in a lot of cases would cluster. And so what I mean by that, I'd have one, and then over the next week or so, I'd have many, many more. This is not the scientific term by any means, but I call them aftershocks. So the first one is the most intense, and then the 5 to 10 that happen over the next week or so are less intense, but still have the smell, the aura, and the nausea and the sweating.
Thank you so much for that description. I think that is going to help so many people better understand what their loved one or what a friend or someone that they don't even know yet what they're experiencing.
Hi, this is Brandon from Cure Epilepsy. Do you have questions about seizures, medications, treatments, or other areas of epilepsy? Cure Epilepsy's new video series, Epilepsy Explained, provides answers to help you better understand the basics of epilepsy. Each month, a different expert offers short, easily understandable answers to questions from our community about a particular area of epilepsy. Doctors and researchers who are leaders in their field will cover questions about seizures, diagnosing epilepsy, medications, surgery, and many more topics. New episodes of Epilepsy Explained will be available on Cure Epilepsy's website and YouTube channel on the third Wednesday of every month. Now back to Seizing Life.
You mentioned that Lamictal worked for a while and then the seizures came back. Tell us about that time period and the next steps you took.
Yeah. So that time period was really marked by a lot of stress, significant increase in stress. So I had started a new job that was extremely stressful for a variety of reasons. We had moved to a new house, which we were renovating. My wife's pride and joy. She's incredible at that, but can be stressful, right? And she was trying to get pregnant, and that was challenging. And so we were going through IVF. So just a lot of stress, and that I think was a big contributing factor. Interestingly enough, while I was in the hospital for one of my surgeries at Johns Hopkins, one of the neurologists really pushed back on my notion that stress is a trigger, and he sort of very forcefully told me there's no scientific evidence to prove that stress is a trigger, which I still find fascinating because I don't think I've met anyone yet with epilepsy where stress isn't a trigger. So when I have more time, I really want to do a research study around this because stress is a trigger for so many different things. But anyway.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I mean, maybe it's the stress causes sleep deprivation because we absolutely know that sleep deprivation can, regardless, your seizures come back. There is a lot going on in your life. Uh, what was your neurologist's treatment?
So that was the difficult part. It was a lot of trial and error. I really felt like a lab rat during those days, and it was sort of wow, this is our best approach. That will increase your lamictal. That didn't work. Okay, let's add this. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, let's try vitamin D. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try, it was just, didn't really feel like there was a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it. And of course, now after doing the research and talking with so many people, that's not that uncommon. It's just hard to believe that in 2024, we still don't know enough about the brain or epilepsy, which is why cure is so important in funding for finding a cure for epilepsy. But
John, you're doing my job for me. I love it.
um, so yeah, it was really, really difficult to be on that hamster wheel, if you will. And then I actually switched to a different neurologist because I needed something different. And I went to Johns Hopkins, and the first thing that this neurologist prescribed for me after I described everything to him, he wanted me to go to the epilepsy monitoring unit for a week-long EEG. And what I had described, I had never done that. I've had countless EEGs, but never been in the hospital for a week. And part of why I think he prescribed that is I was describing to him the pattern of my seizures. So I was sort of analyzing the data, and I noticed that my seizures were occurring, and this is still interesting to me, and I don't have all the answers, but my seizures were occurring approximately every 25 to 35 days. So it was almost like a woman's menstruation cycle. And as I was describing this to him, I see him processing it, but he didn't really say much. So I try to do some research on it. I mean, certainly we know that women's menstruation cycle can impact their seizures, right? But there isn't much on men from that standpoint. But he said, since you know approximately when your seizures will occur, we can time your visit so that you can have a seizure while you're in the hospital. And it worked out perfectly. I had a number of seizures while in the hospital for that week-long EEG.
And were they able to then collect enough data to make to tell you what they recommended?
Oh, Kelly, I so wish they did. But again, as you know, it's not as simple as that. The data was quote unquote inconclusive, which was a word that I heard way too many times. So they then prescribed, so I had to have a PET scan. I had a neuropsychology evaluation, which I spent some time writing about as well. If you haven't had one, don't get one. I sort of liken it to taking the SATs again, which was not a fun experience the first time around. It's over 4-hour examination of your various executive functions and memory and math. And I remember walking out of Johns Hopkins after that, just being so incredibly exhausted. And then, speaking of inconclusive, so we thought, well, PET scan, neuropsychology evaluation, data from week-long EEG, as well as CT scans and all kinds of other things, that should give us the data we need to determine your seizure onset zone. And then my neurologist, after reading the neuropsychology evaluation paperwork or report, told me those same words again. It's still inconclusive. There is one other test that we can do, but it's quite invasive. And okay, tell me more, doc. It's called a stereo EEG or an SEEG. What we do is we drill holes in your head and we thread the electrodes through the holes and implant them in your brain. It's like, wait, did you say drill holes? So that certainly was quite frightening. But at the same time, I was having uncontrolled seizures. And around that time when I was deciding, because it wasn't like you have to do this, it was still my decision. And around that time, we were on a vacation with our family and another family. And my older daughter, who was 3 or 4 at the time, 3, I think, saw me have a tonic-clonic seizure in my sleep. And that actually was pretty common for me. Thankfully, most of my tonic-clonic seizures happened while I was sleeping. And, at that age, she freaked out. My wife happened to be there, and, she kept saying, tell daddy to stop, tell daddy to stop, tell daddy to stop. She's watching as I'm shaking and making the snapping noise with my tongue, and, just uncontrollable, and certainly not, I'm not responding to her because I'm unconscious. And then, as my wife is telling me the story and I see how sad my 3-year-old is, I can't, I have to do something different. So that got me over the fear of having 14 holes drilled in my head.
Amazing what kids will force us to do for ourselves and for them. So you get the SEEG, you have the drills, you have the holes drilled in your head, and then what?
So they expect that I would have, a number of seizures, and so that they could then triangulate all the data and say, okay, this is your seizure onset zone. They had a hypothesis. They were fairly certain, it was in my temporal lobe, but they certainly weren't going to recommend an actual surgery to either ablate or cut or remove that part of my brain without knowing for sure. And of course, 1 week, it was supposed to be a week-long stay. 1 week goes by, no seizures. And, during this period, I'm doing 24-hour sleep deprivation. 2 weeks go by, same thing. And I'd planned to just take a week off and go back to work. And so I'm having to adjust all that. And I'll never forget this, Kelly, if you can indulge me for just a minute. The attending neurologist walks into my room one day after 2 or so weeks, and she brings, all the residents are there, and there's probably 4 or 5 of them. And she says to me, what are your triggers besides sleep deprivation? I said, well, hot showers, like that actually has caused a number of seizures for me. But at this point, I've got wires coming out of the back of my head connected to the EEG machine. So, shower was not an option. And then I was thinking about it some more, and I sort of sheepishly said, alcohol. And she looks at me very seriously and she said, oh, we can do that. And she looks down the line at her residents and she says, hey, Laura, tell John his options. And in my head, I'm like, okay, they're just messing with me. Like, this isn't real, right? And she starts out, she says, well, we have this like sherry dessert wine, we have Bud Ice, and we have Jack Daniels. I'm still like, this isn't real, right? This is a joke. I said, I'll take some Jack. So that evening, Jack Daniels shows up in one of those like orange translucent bottles with the white cap, the childproof cap, like you'd have like prescription cough syrup for your kids, that kind of thing. And I still have a couple of the bottles because I had to keep them just so people
Yes, you did.
believe me, right? And it says my name with Jack Daniels. The only issue was it was just a very, very small amount. It really was not going to be enough to trigger a seizure, but at least I could make a little cocktail at night to entertain me. So 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks, and they're saying to me, okay, we need to just stay for another week. And at that point I was like, guys, I can't, I've paused my life for 3 weeks. My wife is home with our 2 young kids. And so they said, okay, no problem. We can induce a seizure with electrical stimulation. And I don't remember at the time being particularly fearful of that. But I think that had, as I processed it, that had something to do with what happened next. So the morning of the electrical stimulation, I had a seizure right as my neurologist was walking into my room. So no electrical stimulation. They read the EEG data, and it confirmed their hypothesis. And I was out of there before breaking the record for longest stay at the Johns Hopkins epilepsy monitoring unit.
Well, I'm glad that you finally had your seizure. Um, First and last time, I'll say that. So they're able to determine where the seizures are originating from and suggest surgery. Walk us through what that looks like, uh, what the surgery experience was like for you, as well as post surgery.
Yeah. So it was my temporal lobe, my non-dominant hippocampus, um, which is, as they told me, an ideal location for laser ablation surgery, which is still a relatively new procedure and a lot less invasive and a much shorter recovery period than a temporal lobectomy, which was the other surgery. Essentially, they really open your skull and cut out that part of your brain. The laser ablation surgery, they drilled another hole in the back of my head. So a total of 15 holes for those of you who are counting. And then threaded laser fibers through that hole. And then, literally burned my non-dominant hippocampus. 4+ hour procedure. I remember my neurosurgeons were walking me through everything that would happen. It was certainly extremely frightening. A lot of people in my life were sort of like, "You're crazy." But again, I just always thought back to my daughter seeing me have a seizure, and I couldn't do that again. I wake up as I'm being put onto a gurney and being wheeled back to my room at the epilepsy monitoring unit at Hopkins. And as I'm on the gurney, I'm having a seizure. And then another, and then another, and another. I had about 10 seizures in a short period of time, focal aware seizures. And you can imagine, I was sort of like, what is going on? I just had surgery to eliminate seizures, and now I just had a cluster of 10 of them after waking up right after. It's like, what in the world is going on? What have I done? Finally, the neurosurgeon comes in and he says to me, "This is actually fairly common. We're just poking around in there or messing around. Like, things can happen." And I know it sounds really strange, but when we get in there, just this kind of thing can happen. Now, if it continues to happen, that's a problem. But I'm fairly certain that this is going to be an isolated thing, and thankfully it was. But that was really, really scary. He told me before the surgery, plan to take 2 weeks off from work, and my response to him was, "How about one?" And neurosurgeons don't really have a sense of humor, at least mine didn't. And he said to me, "You're going to be on a very heavy dose of steroids and other medication. You're going to probably have trouble sleeping." The recovery in the hospital was a couple of days. I'm back home. It's been probably about 2 or 3 weeks, and I just still feel awful. I am more fatigued and exhausted than I had ever been in my life. And he told me 2 weeks. I was expecting one. We're now at 3. Like, what's going on here? So he readmitted me to do some more tests. Thankfully, everything looked good with my brain. They worry about swelling, they worry about bleeding, they worry about a variety of things, but everything looked good. They did a whole blood panel, saw that my iron levels were low, so they gave me iron through an IV. But nothing really changed. Then my neurosurgeon says to me, I just had 2 patients recently that, had very similar procedures to you with, an SEEG and laser ablation surgery within, a month of each other. And, it really took them, about a year until they felt kind of back to normal. I was sort of like, well, that would have been helpful information before. Here I was preparing myself for 2 weeks. And so anyway, it really was every bit of a year, Kelly, before I started to feel quote unquote normal again.
Wow. Wow. And so how is your epilepsy today? Did I guess long term, knocking on all things wood, did the surgery work?
Yes, thankfully it did. I have only had one seizure since the surgery, which is coming up on, I guess, about 2.5 years now. And that was really only because I forgot to take my medication. So proof that the medication is working. I really hoped that eventually I could be completely medication free because, as you know, the medications don't have the most fun side effects, but they're working. We've weaned down a little bit, but at this point, we've agreed like let's just keep it where it is. Everything is mostly good. So yes, thankfully, it seems to the surgeries have seemed to have worked really well.
That infamous quality of life balance, which brings me to what I am actually most excited to talk to you about, which is your book it's about to come out, yes, very soon. And I cannot wait to read it. The more epilepsy literature that we can get out into the world, the better. I think your story is so compelling, especially because you were diagnosed as an adult. You have an entirely different viewpoint. Your experience it's so valuable, I think, to getting the grander population to understand epilepsy and our community.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. Let me start by saying writing a book was never on my bucket list. This was not, okay, someday I'm definitely, no, that was never a thing. But I was in the hospital for over 40 days and nights. And, the mind tends to wander when that happens. And I started documenting all of the crazy things that had happened in the 14 or 15 years since I was diagnosed. And when I got out of the hospital, I went to see a good friend who's in the literary world, and I ran the idea by him. He loved it. He then introduced me to a bunch of other people in the literary world, and off we went. But writing a book, as you know, is quite the endeavor. 2.5 years later, yes, it is. It should be out this summer, June, July, is what my publisher is telling me. But I won't get an official date for at least a few more weeks. But somewhere in that June, July timeframe.
Well, congratulations. Tell us the full name of the book with subtitle.
So the book title is Seizing Today, Discovering Purpose and Authenticity in a Life-Changing Diagnosis. It'll be available in your typical Amazon, Barnes & Noble, et cetera, all those places.
Amazing. So. Well, everyone needs to make sure that they go out, that they get their copy. I know that I cannot wait to read it. Thank you, John, and best of luck to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John, for sharing your experiences with us. John's story is a reminder that epilepsy can affect anyone at any age. 1 in 26 Americans will develop epilepsy in their lifetime, and, like John, 50% of those diagnosed cannot find a cause for their epilepsy. This is why Cure Epilepsy has been funding groundbreaking research for more than 20 years. We aim to uncover the secrets of epilepsy, discover new therapies to improve the lives of those living with epilepsy, and ultimately find a cure. If you would like to help us achieve our goal of a world without epilepsy, please visit cureepilepsy.org/donate. Thank you.
The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of Cure Epilepsy. The information contained herein is provided for general information only and does not offer medical advice or recommendations. Individuals should not rely on this information as a substitute for consultations with qualified healthcare professionals who are familiar with individual medical conditions and needs. Cure Epilepsy strongly recommends that care and treatment decisions related to epilepsy and any other medical conditions be made in consultation with the patient's physician or other qualified healthcare professionals who are familiar with the individual's specific health situation.